Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes your brain seems to work super hard on a task, and other times it takes shortcuts, maybe even making you miss obvious things? Well, this fascinating new study dives deep into that very question about how our minds represent information. Imagine your brain is like a supercomputer processing all the sights and sounds around you. For decades, scientists have thought that our brain, when it perceives something, creates a really detailed map, like a complete probability distribution of all possible interpretations. Think of it like trying to identify an object in a blurry photo. Your brain might be considering many possibilities, maybe it's a dog, maybe it's a fox, and assigning a probability to each. This idea is called the Bayesian coding hypothesis, and it suggests our perceptions are quite complex. But here is the catch. We often see people making what looks like suboptimal decisions in experiments. This means they don't always choose the choice that a perfectly rational probability crunching brain would. Some researchers thought this was proof that our brains just can't handle really complex representation. They argued that maybe our brains only represent things in simpler ways, like just the single most likely option, or a small sample of options. However, the authors of this new paper have a different idea. They propose that this apparent suboptimality isn't because our brains can't form complex representations, but because we're smart about how we use our limited mental resources. They call this resource-rationality. It's like our brain is taking shortcuts when it realizes it doesn't need all that complex information to get the job done easily. Think about it. If a task is simple and doesn't require much attention, why would your brain expend a lot of energy creating a super detailed representation? It is more efficient to use a simpler one. But if the task demands more careful consideration, then maybe our brains do create those more complex representations. This paper wanted to test exactly that. They set up a series of experiments, tweaking a visual task to see if they could force people's brains to show they could use complex representations when needed. So they started with a task where participants saw an array of colored circles and had to pick the dominant color, meaning the color that appeared most often. This original task, like one done by other researchers, often led to findings suggesting simpler representations. The twist in experiment one was introducing new types of choices. Besides the usual choices where the most dominant color was always an option, they added trials where the most dominant color was excluded. These are called non-dominant 2AFC trials. To succeed on these, participants could just focus on identifying the most dominant color. They had to consider other colors too, essentially needing a broader understanding of the color distribution. They ran this task in two phases, a standard one and an adjusted one, where these trickier non-dominant trials were more common. Their prediction was that in the adjusted phase, where these simpler shortcuts wouldn't work as well, people would be forced to use more complex representations. To figure out what kind of representations people were using, they used the mathematical modeling approach. They proposed three different models of representation. A population model representing the full distribution of possibilities. The most complex, A2, high-guess model just looking at the top two options, and a summary model that only considers the single most likely option, the simplest. They then fit these models to the participants' choices in the experiment. What they found in experiment 1 was interesting, but not entirely conclusive. In the standard phase, the simple summary model tended to fit best, meaning people's behavior was best explained by them using the simplest representation. However, when they looked at the adjusted phase, where those non-dominant trials were mixed in, the results were less clear. The differences between the models were much smaller, suggesting that the introduction of those harder trials made it so that simple and complex representations explained the behavior similarly well. This hinted that maybe people were adapting, but it didn't strongly point to complex representations being used. The authors noted that maybe encountering the harder trials sometimes helped people shift to a broader strategy, which then influenced how they performed even on the easier standard trials. Experiment 1 showed that simpler strategies were often favored, but it didn't definitively prove that complex representations weren't available. So, for experiment 2, they ramped up the challenge. They altered the distribution of colors in each array of circles. Instead of having three non-dominant colors appear equally often, they created a more uneven distribution, like having one color appear a lot, another a moderate amount, and others much less frequently. The goal here was to create a situation where the population model, the complex one, and the summary model, the simple one, would make significantly different predictions about accuracy. They wanted to amplify the difference. They still used the dominant and non-dominant 2 AFC trial types. This time, the results were much clearer. For the dominant 2 AFC trials, the two highest model, was the consistently best fit for most participants. This suggests that people weren't just using the single most dominant color, but they weren't necessarily using the full distribution either. They were somewhere in the middle, keeping track of the two most likely options. Then, they looked at the adjusted phase, which included those trickier non-dominant 2 AFC trials. Here things got even more interesting. The two highest model still performed very well, but its performance relative to the population model, the most complex one, shifted depending on the order of the phases. If participants did the adjusted phase first, the population model performed similarly to the two highest model. But if they did the standard phase first, the two highest model often outperformed the population model. This suggested that the simpler resource-rational strategy from the standard phase might have carried over, making the two highest model look better even when a more complex one might have been required. While the two highest model seemed pretty good, it wasn't universally the best. Experiment 2 showed that a middle ground representation, the two highest model, was often sufficient. But could people, or rather, would they use the full distribution representation if the task absolutely required it? That was the question for Experiment 3. They made the task even more demanding. They modified the trial types again, significantly increasing the proportion of non-dominant 2 AFC trials that featured the two least dominant colors. This specific type of trial is where the two highest model and the population model would really diverge. The two highest model would fail because it only tracks the top two. And if those aren't the options presented in a non-dominant trial, it is guessing the population model, by having the entire distribution, could still potentially solve it. They also changed the color distribution in the stimuli to further emphasize this difference. Crucially, in this experiment, they only used the adjusted phase to avoid any carry over effects from simpler strategies. And this is where they found compelling evidence for complex representations. The population model, the most complex one, provided the best fit to the data. It was overwhelmingly more likely than the other models. This suggests that when the task design made rational shortcuts ineffective and absolutely required a detailed understanding of all the possibilities, participants' behavior was best explained by them, using a full probabilistic representation. So, what does all this mean? The authors argue that the suboptimal performance seen in earlier studies might not be a sign of inherent limitations in our perceptual decision making circuits. Instead, it could be evidence of our brains being very smart and resource-rational. When a task doesn't demand it, our brains cleverly simplify things by focusing on the most likely options, saving energy and cognitive effort. But when the task is designed to truly require it, like in Experiment 3, participants can and do use complex representations, like a full distribution of possibilities. This research adds a really important point for how we study perception. Researchers need to be careful that their tasks aren't making it too easy for participants to take shortcuts. If a simpler strategy can explain the behavior, it doesn't mean complex representations aren't there, just that they weren't needed at that moment. This study highlights that suboptimality might actually be a sign of intelligence, not a deficit. It's about the optimal use of limited computational resources. The complexity of our perceptual representation seems to be flexible, adapting to the demands of the task at hand. It's a nuanced view that suggests our perception is not a fixed processing engine, but a dynamic system that smartly manages its capabilities based on what we need to do. In my opinion, this research is quite impactful because it reframes our understanding of perceptual limitations. The idea that we might be taking shortcuts to be efficient, rather than being fundamentally incapable of complex thought, is liberating. However, it is important to remember that while Experiment 3 provided strong evidence for the population model, it was still in a controlled lab setting. Future work exploring these ideas in more naturalistic, less constrained environments would be very valuable. Could this resource-rationality explain why we sometimes make mistakes while driving, or why we might miss subtle cues in social interactions? It is a fascinating avenue to explore. This research is a great example of how careful experimental design can uncover deeper truths about how our minds work. If you found this breakdown interesting, please hit that like button. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how your own mind takes shortcuts. And subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more dives into the amazing world of cognitive science. See you next time.